Okay, so I want to start by thanking all of the folks at Sutter for putting this together. It's really inspiring to see the work that you're doing in bringing integrative and functional medicine into the healthcare system in a way that patients can access. It's, as someone who is really passionate about this, it's really a joy to see it happening. So thank you. All right, so can everybody hear me okay? We've got 2 microphones here, so hopefully we won't get any feedback. Push that down here. So tonight I'm going to talk about 4 topics. So the first is that chronic disease is on the rise. I'm going to share some pretty frightening statistics with you. The consequences are profound, and unfortunately conventional medicine, at least how it's set up right now, is failing to address it. The second thing is that chronic disease may now be very common, but it's not normal. And there's a big difference between what's common and normal. We're going to talk about that. The third thing is that our behavior and our environment, not our genes, is the primary driver of chronic disease. And number 4 is that realigning our behavior and our environment with our genes is the single most important step we can take to prevent and reverse chronic disease. 60% of Americans now have a chronic disease. 40% now suffer from multiple chronic diseases. Chronic disease is now responsible for 7 of 10 deaths. And it's not just affecting adults. In 1994, 13% of kids had chronic disease. In 2006, just 12 years later, that number went up to 27%. So more than doubling in just 12 years. And this increase was especially notable for obesity, asthma, and learning disorders. 1 billion people now around the world suffer from diabetes and obesity combined, a condition Mark Hyman likes to call diabesity. 40% of Americans now, according to the latest CDC statistics, are obese, and 100 million have either prediabetes or diabetes. That's 1 in 3 Americans now with prediabetes or diabetes. Obesity has quadrupled in adolescents in the past 30 years, and almost 20% now of kids between the ages 6 and 11 are now obese. Testing. How's that? Better? Okay, good. Some estimates suggest today that up to 1 in 6 Americans now have an autoimmune disease. About 85 autoimmune diseases have now been identified, and that number is growing every year. Again, according to the CDC, autism prevalence has more than doubled since the year 2000, and it's not just because of increased rates of detection. Now, the most heartbreaking part of this for me is that there's every indication that things will get worse before they get better. Today is the first generation of kids in modern history, since we have been measuring lifespan, that is predicted to live shorter lifespans than their parents. Now that, as a parent myself, that's heartbreaking. If current trends continued, we see the same rate of increase in the number of people that are overweight and diabetes. In 2 decades, 95% of Americans would be overweight, and 1 in 3 would have diabetes. Don't worry, there's some good news coming after this. Just stay with me. The rise of chronic disease has had a huge impact on patients, on us as people. On a personal level, it erodes our quality of life. It interferes with our relationships and our work, and it undermines our confidence and our autonomy. But there's also a huge economic cost to individuals. Medical expenses are the #1 cause of individual bankruptcy, far ahead of credit card debt and student loans. Now, the economic implications of this on a social scale are simply staggering. 90% of the $3.5 trillion that we spend every year goes toward the treatment of chronic disease. Our annual healthcare expenditure in 2017 reached $3.5 trillion. And that was almost 25%, or 1/4 of our gross domestic product that year. That amounts to nearly $11,000 per year for every man, woman, and child living in the US. If healthcare continues to increase at the pace it has been increasing over the past few decades, some experts predict that the US could be completely bankrupt by the year 2035 or 2040, meaning we'd be spending all of our resources on healthcare alone. We wouldn't have anything left for education or other activities that the government needs to support. Globally, it's estimated that expenditures on chronic disease will reach almost $50 trillion by 2030. Now, this is an almost impossible number to imagine, but to put it in perspective, it's equivalent to the 6 largest economies in the world. So I mentioned in the introduction that chronic disease has become so common that we think it's normal, but there's a really big difference between what's common and what's normal. Contrary to popular belief, human beings are naturally vital and healthy when we live in alignment with our genes and our biology. It is not normal for us to develop multiple chronic diseases, especially at an early age, but even into our older years. How do we know this? Well, consider a recent study of a population called the Tsimane. They are a subsistence farming and hunter-gatherer group in Bolivia, and they eat primarily meat and fish, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and some starchy plants like plantains. They walk an average of 17,000 steps a day, which is about 8 miles. They spend a lot of time outdoors. They get plenty of sleep. They aren't exposed to a lot of artificial light at night, as Dr. Max was talking about. And some researchers went down there and they wanted to find out what are the rates of heart disease, which is still the #1 killer in the US, cardiovascular disease, in this population. So they measured the incidence of atherosclerosis in the Tsimane and found that the prevalence of it was 80% lower than what it is in the US. And they did CT scans and found that nearly 9 in 10 Tsimane adults had, between the ages of 40 and 94 years old, had completely clean arteries and thus faced almost no risk of heart disease. Now, many people have argued, okay, well, hunter-gatherers don't acquire heart disease because they don't live long enough to acquire it. Well, as you heard, this study included adults all the way up to age 94. And the researchers found that the average 80-year-old in the Tsimane group had the same vascular age as an American in his or her mid-50s. Now, the Tsimane are not an exception. Until very recently in our evolutionary history, they were the rule. Both our Paleolithic ancestors and contemporary hunter-gatherers that have been studied all over the world are remarkably lean and fit and virtually free of chronic inflammatory diseases. They're also superior to us in nearly every measure of health and fitness, from body mass index to blood pressure to insulin sensitivity to oxygen consumption to vision to bone density. Now again, some people might be thinking, well, so what? Our ancestors might have been healthier than we were on average when they were younger, but they all died when they were 30. How many have heard this argument about looking at Paleolithic people? Well, it is true that our ancestors had shorter lifespans than we do today on average. But those averages don't consider challenges that are largely absent now from modern life that they still faced. Particularly a complete lack of emergency medical care. So this led to higher rates of infant mortality and higher rates of death from warfare, trauma, accidents, and exposure to the elements. Now, some medical anthropologists have done studies in contemporary hunter-gatherer groups that have access to even the most rudimentary forms of medical care, like walking for half a day to a rural medical clinic. And what they found is that these populations have lifespans equivalent to our own in the West, but the difference is they reach these ages without acquiring all of the chronic inflammatory diseases that characterize our old age in the industrialized world. They don't tend to get obesity. They don't develop heart disease. They don't develop diabetes, gout, hypertension, and even most cancers. So the Tsimane were a good example of that I shared with you. But there are several others, like the Kitava and Tukasenta in the South Pacific, and the Maasai, the Hadza, and the Kungsan in Africa. Okay, so what happened? What transformed us from healthy, vital people that were virtually free of chronic inflammatory disease to a sick, overweight, and unhappy people? So here's the punchline. It was not our genes. They're mostly the same as they have been since the Paleolithic era. There's been about a 10% shift in our genes since that period of time. So 90% of our genes are the same as they were during the Paleolithic. And people living in the industrialized world today have very similar genes to people like the Tsimane and those other contemporary hunter-gatherer groups. I'm not saying that our genes don't play an important role. They absolutely do. But they determine more what diseases we develop rather than whether we develop disease at all. So for example, if you took 10 Tsimane people living in Bolivia and you dropped them into New York City, maybe 2 or 3 would develop diabetes, a couple would acquire an autoimmune disease, maybe 2 would have a gastrointestinal disorder like IBS, or maybe 1 would develop depression. And this is why we see certain diseases cluster in certain populations. So, for example, 80% of the population in American Samoa is now obese, 80%. And that increase happened in lockstep with the introduction of the standard American diet there. So there's obviously something about their genes that uniquely predispose them to developing obesity compared to the average American, where obesity rates are 40%. Another example is that when people who are following a traditional diet and lifestyle move to the industrialized world, they rapidly develop the diseases of civilization. And this has been observed with many different immigrant populations to countries like the United States, the UK, and Australia. I imagine we have some people in this room who have witnessed this even in their own families. And when that transition happens, when someone who's living a traditional diet and lifestyle moves and acquires those diseases, it's not their genes that's changing. Genes do not change that quickly. It's the environment and the behavior and how that affects the expression of their genes that is changing. Our lifespan is also primarily determined by our environment. There was a relatively new study involving the genes of over 400 million people, so pretty big sample size. And they found that less than 10% of our lifespan is developed by our genes, which means that over 90% of our lifespan is determined by our diet, our behavior, and our lifestyle. Now, all of this points to the same conclusion, which is that our behavior and our environment are the primary drivers of our health and of disease. And recent studies have backed this up. One study showed recently that 85% of chronic disease risk is environmental and not genetic. So why is this? Why is it that our genes don't play a bigger role? Well, at one time, scientists definitely thought that our genes did hold the key to understanding and eventually even preventing and reversing disease. The 20th century, as I'm sure you all know, was characterized by some pretty amazing developments in this area, including the discovery of DNA itself, the development of the polymerase chain reaction method, or PCR method, for amplifying DNA, and then ultimately the complete mapping of the human genome. So this led to an era of what has been referred to as biological determinism, which is the idea that human health is entirely controlled by genes. And it consequently led to some pretty bold proclamations like this one from Lord Sainsbury. We now have the possibility of achieving all we ever hoped for from medicine. And another from Michael Dexter from the Wellcome Trust. Mapping the human genome has been compared with putting a man on the moon, but I believe it's more than that. This is the outstanding achievement not only of our lifetime, but in terms of human history. Now, unfortunately, that promise didn't really pan out, did it? I mean, those of us who are old enough to remember these days, there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm about what the breakthroughs that would happen from sequencing the genome. But so far that has not happened. And before the genome was sequenced, scientists expected to find about 140,000 genes. The body makes about 100,000 proteins. There are about 40,000 regulatory proteins that are needed to make other proteins. And so the natural assumption was that we would find one gene per protein. And so researchers were shocked to discover that humans actually have only 23,688 genes. If genes really do run the show, 24,000 is not only not enough to create our bodies and keep them running, it's not even enough to keep our brain functioning. So this was our first big clue that our genes do not run the show, at least not on their own. And ironically, Craig Venter, who was one of the first to sequence the human genome, was one of the first to recognize its limitations when he said, "We simply don't have enough genes for this idea of biological determinism to work." The majority of polymorphisms, mutations of single genes, which are referred to as SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, are actually quite common in the population. But most of them have low penetrance, which means they don't often manifest in clinical disease, at least without some environmental influence. So if it wasn't only our genes that determine our disease risk, scientists speculated that there must be some way that the environment interacts with our genes to influence our disease risk. And this relationship between our genes and the environment is what is studied in the field of epigenetics, which the literal meaning is epi on top of genetics, on top of our genes. And the simplest definition of epigenetics is changes in gene activity that don't involve alterations of the underlying genes themselves, but still do get passed on to at least one successive generation. So we now know that our genes can be activated or turned on, or deactivated or turned off by the environment outside of the cell. Now this means both the environment outside of the cell, but still inside of the body, like biological, neurological, emotional, and psychological influences, and also the environment that's both outside of the cell and outside of the body, like our diet, our lifestyle, air quality, toxins, etc. And this activation of genes has a far greater impact on our health than the genes themselves. And it's constantly changing based on environmental factors, which are now collectively referred to as the exposome. So the exposome is a concept that was originally proposed by Dr. Christopher Wilde in 2005. He's an evolutionary biologist. And he defined it as the sum of all non-genetic exposures in an individual lifetime, starting from the moment of conception and going to the moment of death. And it encompasses everything from the food we eat, to the air we breathe, to the social interactions that we have, to the lifestyle choices we make, to our inherent metabolic and cellular activity. Now, there are three categories of the exposome. The first is the specific external, and this refers to things like our diet, the water we drink, physical activity, maybe the home and personal care products that we use. The second is the general external. So this refers to the broader environmental influences, things like air pollution, social interaction, whether we live in an urban or a rural area, and climate. And then the third category is internal. So this refers to metabolism, hormones, our microbiome, like Dr. Max was talking about, our inflammatory status, etc. Now, with all of this in mind, let's look more closely at how gene expression works. Our DNA contains information that's waiting to be read and activated to create proteins, which in turn regulate every aspect of life. The DNA is covered in a protein sleeve that acts as a filter between the DNA strand and the cellular environment. So you can think of DNA as like a blueprint, and the sleeve as the protective tube that you use to carry the blueprint. Now, until that blueprint is removed from the sleeve, it's just potential information that has not been expressed as a protein. And this is where the exposome comes in. Exposure to factors either inside of the body or outside of the body, as we discussed, an emotion, a nutrient, a toxin, results in a chemical signal, like a neuropeptide, being sent to the cell. And when the signal arrives at the cell, it penetrates the cell membrane, goes inside of the cell, unwraps the DNA sleeve, and it reads that information. Then RNA is produced from the regulatory protein that is reading the gene, and the gene is then finally activated or expressed. Now, there are several mechanisms that are involved with gene expression, and these include DNA methylation, histone acetylation, chromatin remodeling, and non-coding RNA mechanisms. So we don't have time to go into all of them tonight, but I'd like to take a closer look at DNA methylation just to give you an example of how this works. So if you remember back to high school biology, DNA has 4 nucleotides: cytosine, guanine, thymine, and adenine. And DNA methylation refers to the addition of a methyl group, which is 1 carbon atom bonded to 3 hydrogen atoms, to the DNA strand itself. And this has the effect of preventing the gene from expressing. So this is more of an off switch. It prevents the gene from converting its information into instructions for making a protein or other molecule. So as I said, you can think of DNA as kind of an off switch for genes, or DNA methylation rather, as an off switch for genes, and it can also act as a volume control, which can either increase or decrease the amount of proteins that are made by that gene. DNA methylation is vital to growth and development, stabilizing DNA and turning off potentially harmful genes and processes. And research has found links between DNA methylation and a variety of conditions like cancer, lupus, muscular dystrophy, and congenital birth defects. So a couple examples of how the exposome can impact our health via this mechanism of DNA methylation. Air pollution has been shown to have several negative impacts on health, and in large part it does this by wreaking epigenetic havoc on our DNA. It affects how our genes express in an adverse way. But studies have found that taking vitamin B12, folate, and B6, all of which are methyl donors and support methylation, actually mitigates those epigenetic effects. Another example is low vitamin D in pregnant women is associated with poor fetal growth, childhood obesity, and low bone density. Key functions of the placenta, like transporting nutrients to the baby, are controlled by gene expression, which is in part mediated by vitamin D levels. One study showed that short-term supplementation with vitamin D during pregnancy led to rapid changes in DNA methylation in the placenta. So this was actually changing gene expression in the placenta by altering its methylation status. Now, unlike our genes, which remain the same throughout our entire life, changes in gene expression can happen very quickly. So this is the good news part of the presentation. In one study, for example, of about 30 men with prostate cancer, following an intensive diet and lifestyle regimen, upregulated 48 genes related to tumor suppression and downregulated 453 genes related to tumor promotion in just 3 months. Another small study of 23 slightly overweight sedentary Swedish men found that adding a spinning or aerobics class just twice a week for 6 months altered 7,000 genes. This is nearly 1/3 of the genes in the entire human genome. So these studies document pretty significant changes in gene expression in just 3 to 6 months, but other studies have shown that gene expression can change daily and perhaps even from moment to moment. But like genes themselves, changes in gene expression can be passed on to future generations. That's part of the definition of epigenetics. And Dr. Michael Skinner was the first researcher to show that these epigenetic changes are heritable. He led a 2005 study that exposed pregnant rats to pesticides, and the male pups of the exposed rats also had higher rates of infertility and decreased sperm production with epigenetic changes in 2 genes. Now, these changes were present in 90% of the 4 generations of males that followed, even though those subsequent generations were not exposed to the pesticides. There's also evidence that epigenetic changes are heritable in humans. One of the best known examples of this was the Dutch winter hunger cohort. So this is a group of people that lived through a period of famine in Holland during World War II from November of 1944 to May of 1945. And during this period, they often had to survive on food rations of less than 1,000 calories a day. Now, babies that were in utero during this period experienced a wide range of adverse effects later in their life, like higher rates of obesity, diabetes and cardiovascular disease. They were more likely to be infertile, and they had higher rates of personality disorders, depression, and even psychosis. Identical twins are another good example of the relationship between genes and gene expression. They have exactly the same genes, of course, but not the same gene expression. This will vary depending on their environment. So there was a great study out of Spain that looked at this, and they examined 40 pairs of identical twins between the ages of 3 and 74. And they found that younger twins who lived more similar lifestyles and who had spent more years together had similar epigenetic patterns, similar patterns of gene expression. Whereas older twins, especially those with dissimilar lifestyles or who had spent fewer years together, had very different epigenetic patterns. This explains why identical twins don't have exactly the same risk of disease. And in fact, we see discordance rates of up to 50%, even in highly heritable conditions like schizophrenia. So this means that if one twin has schizophrenia, the other twin only has a 50% chance of having it. Now, earlier I used the analogy of DNA as a blueprint. A blueprint, of course, serves as a plan for a house or a building. It provides the basic structure and framework for what it will look like. But the house or building that could be built from a particular blueprint could vary significantly, right? The builder might use different materials, different doors, windows, fixtures, paint color, etc. And all of those choices will impact what the final building will look like. Likewise, our DNA provides a blueprint for our bodies, but the choices that we make throughout our lives, and even the choices our grandparents and our parents made before we were born, influence how that blueprint manifests by changing the expression of our genes. So what does this all mean? As I said in the beginning, there's bad news and there's good news. The bad news is that choices our parents and grandparents made do have some impact on our disease risk. And choices that we've made, perhaps before we were all as wise as we are now, affect our kids and subsequently their kids' disease risk. But the good news is that our genes are not our destiny. The changes we make affect gene expression and our health and our risk of disease in real time. So let's look at a few examples of this, starting with diet. So diet affects gene expression by several mechanisms. Studies have shown that certain dietary compounds bind to transcription factors which regulate their activity, so they affect protein expression. Others have shown that different types and quantities of macronutrients, protein, carbohydrate, and fat, can affect gene expression. And diets that emphasize real foods rather than processed and refined foods have been shown also to have a positive impact on gene expression. Dr. Max talked a lot about sleep, and you won't be surprised to learn that sleep has a potent impact on gene expression. A 2013 study in the UK examined the effects of sleep deprivation on gene expression. They restricted sleep to 6 hours a night for 1 week in 26 healthy volunteers, and then they had a control group that slept for 10 hours a night. They found that over 700 genes were altered in the sleep-restricted group, and these genes were involved in things like sleep homeostasis, stress response, metabolism, and even regulation of other genes. A 2012 study in cell metabolism found that even brief periods of vigorous exercise cause structural and chemical changes in DNA molecules within muscles. And a 2014 study found that endurance training altered 5,000 sites on the genome of muscle cells. A study at Ohio State found that stress affected more than 170 genes, completely shutting off 100 of them. And on the other hand, in a study of meditation at Massachusetts General, novice meditators were able to change about 1,600 genes, with about 875 upregulated for health and about 690 downregulated for stress, whereas seasoned meditators were able to change the expression of about 2,200 genes, most of them improving the response to chronic stress. So let's talk a little bit about the solution, which I refer to as realignment. The evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky once said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And what he meant was that all organisms, down to the most simple single-cell organism all the way up to human beings, have evolved to survive and thrive in a particular environment. And when that environment changes faster than our genes can adapt, you get a mismatch between the environment and our genes. And this mismatch is a core principle of evolutionary biology, and it applies to humans as much as it applies to any other organism in nature. Now let's look at some examples of mismatch in our modern environment with our genes. So our ancestors ate, as I said before, primarily meat and fish, wild fruits and vegetables, some nuts and seeds, and some starchy plants and tubers. These foods are nutrient dense, they're low in calories, and they're anti-inflammatory. Now contrast this with today, when 60% of the calories the average American consumes are from not just processed food, but ultra-processed food. So the top 6 foods in the American diet by calories are bread, sugar-sweetened beverages, pizza, alcohol, chicken dishes, primarily fried chicken, like chicken nuggets, and grain-based desserts. These 6 foods comprise the majority of calories that most Americans are eating. Both our hunter-gatherer ancestors and contemporary hunter-gatherers walked an average of 10 to 15,000 steps a day. And this was punctuated by brief periods of more intense physical activity. Contrast that with today, when the typical American walks an average of 5,000 to 6,000 steps a day and sits for an average of 60 to 70% of his or her day, which is an average of 6 hours. Sleep, of course, another major difference. Hunter-gatherers sleep on average 7 to 9 hours a night. Insomnia is almost non-existent. In fact, when the researchers who went down to study the Tsimane, their rates of heart disease, asked them about insomnia, they had a problem because there was no word for insomnia in the Tsimane language, so they couldn't actually communicate what they were trying to ask them. So contrast that with today, when 1/3 of Americans now get fewer than 6 hours of sleep, and that's up from just 2% getting fewer than 6 hours in 1960. So that's a profound change in just half a century. And if you remember the study that I referred to a few slides back, getting less than 6 hours of sleep for just 1 week led to pretty significant changes in gene expression. We also know, as again Dr. Max covered in detail, that exposure to artificial light at night, which was rare in hunter-gatherer societies but is common in our modern world, profoundly impacts our circadian clock, which in turn influences nearly every system of the body, including brainwave patterns, hormone production, cell regulation, immune function, and metabolism. And in fact, some recent research suggests that our circadian clock controls between 10 to 15% of our gene expression. This explains why things like shift work, long-distance travel across time zones, and abnormal light exposure is associated with everything from cancer to cardiovascular disease to obesity and diabetes. So there are, of course, many other differences between how hunter-gatherers live and how we live today, and these include stress levels, our social structure, time for leisure and play, etc. But the important takeaway is that when our diet, behavior, and lifestyle are in alignment with what our genes are adapted for, we are naturally healthy and vital. And this is especially true if we have the added benefit of modern medical care for trauma and emergencies and infections. So it follows that returning to this ancestral template is the best way to prevent and even reverse chronic disease. Now, this isn't about recreating the Paleolithic lifestyle. You don't have to wear a loincloth or sleep out in the backyard to get the benefits of this, although you can if you want to. And as Dr. Max was saying, maybe that's a good idea to figure out your chronotype. But this is more about bringing our modern habits into closer alignment with what we know works best for our biology. And an example of this would be, we know that the blue light from screens suppresses our melatonin production, it can increase cortisol levels, and it can have a range of effects that Dr. Max mentioned. But there are steps you can take to mitigate that. So for example, most operating systems in smartphones now have a setting that you can use. It's called night shift in iOS, where it will reduce the amount of blue light that is emitted automatically once the sun goes down. So that was intentionally put there because of the overwhelming amount of research showing how harmful the blue light from screens can be. There are also glasses that you can buy on Amazon and many other places that have an amber tint that filters out much of the blue light that is emitted from these screens. So these are relatively simple steps that you can take to mitigate some of the impact of our modern lifestyle. So what to do? How do we put all of this together to improve our health and our lifespan? Well, I would argue that focusing on the basics is the most important step we can take by far. I think sometimes we get a little bit too wrapped up in making it complicated, but a large study last year showed that adopting just 5 health habits can extend our lifespan by an average of 13 years. 13 years. So these habits were maintaining a healthy body weight, getting at least 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise a day, not smoking, not drinking excessively, and following a healthy diet. This study didn't look at sleep, but I bet if they had, that would have increased the benefit even more. Hard to say what, but probably at least another couple of years. So these are simple things, right? We're not talking about really complex things like intermittent fasting and ketogenic diet and high-intensity interval training and meditating for 3 hours a day. Just following these 5 basic steps will improve your average life expectancy by 13 years, in large part by regulating your gene expression. So here's the unfortunate news. Only about 6% of Americans consistently engage in what the CDC defines as the top 5 health behaviors, which are identical to the ones on the previous slide with one exception. Instead of a healthy diet, they chose getting enough sleep. So this is why we have an epidemic of chronic disease. It's not because of our genes, it's because most of us are making the wrong choices on a daily basis about our behavior and our environment and our lifestyle. So absolutely start with the basics, maintaining a healthy weight, not smoking, not drinking excessively, following a healthy diet, getting enough exercise, and getting enough sleep. And then once you've got those basics down, the next step I think would be to focus on things like managing your stress, reducing your toxic burden, cultivating more pleasure and connection, leaving time for play, which is a big part of our ancestral heritage, and spending time outdoors. These have all been shown to have a powerful effect on gene expression and health span. Okay, so if you'd like to learn more, my website is chriskresser.com, and there's lots of free articles and resources, ebooks and things like that there. And then if you're interested in the training programs, we have a one-year training program for doctors and other licensed clinicians in functional medicine, and then a one-year program for people who are interested in becoming a health coach and supporting folks in making these crucial diet, behavior, and lifestyle changes that, as we've seen, impact gene expression and are the primary determinants of our health and our disease risk. So thank you all for listening, and thanks again to the folks at Sutter for making this happen.